you very much, Jarita, for offering a talk on a topic that seems to interest lots of people. So, Jarita, sorry, we already lost a few minutes, and I keep it short and sweet. So
it's okay. All right, thank you. So I've timed my talk. It's about 40 minutes. So yes, I'm very unusual in that I have 3 affiliations, one in the US, one in the United Kingdom, and one in South Africa. So I have money scattered around the world, is what that amounts to. So in my old age, I've become disabled. I have hearing aids. So I want to make my presentations as accessible as possible. And so you're going to see the font is called NITheCS Info font that I use. And they say that it's most accessible for people who have vision issues like dyslexia. And what I find interesting is that who is Tiresias? It's the blind seer in Greek mythology. And so I found this, he's here. I found this faceplate from the British Museum because the British have stolen everything. And here's Juno, and here's Jupiter. So Jupiter, you see, is the personification of the planet Jupiter. So you have a little cultural astronomy even at the beginning. I have only 2 takeaways, very simple takeaways for this talk. So the continent of Africa is made up of over 50 countries and over 3,000 ethnic groups. Thus, studying African cultural astronomy is an enormous undertaking, and we only scratched the surface. I want you to gain an understanding of some of the ways that astronomy and sky knowledge is entwined in culture in Africa. So, starting with Africa, provocatively upside down, but the world is a sphere. There is no up and there is no down. So south is at the top, and when you're facing south, west is actually on your right and east is on your left. So that is the scale of this wonderful map of Africa, and the equator is right there. So what have I got for you? There's 7 island nations that may or may not be counted as being part of Africa. Across the equator, there's 6 nations. Gosh, every time I say a S, it really echoes. Most African countries are actually in the northern hemisphere. So when they say the global north, that's a concept. It doesn't mean northern hemisphere versus southern hemisphere. I thought I got rid of my email. Just ignore that. Hopefully, oh, good, it doesn't show. And then finally, there's 13 countries in the southern hemisphere. These. Okay. Now, the other way around, with north at the top, we have the equator, and we have the tropics, 23.5 degrees north and 23.5 degrees south. The north one is called the Tropic of Cancer. The south one is called the Tropic of Capricorn. So what are we talking about? So here's our sky. I'm using a free software called Stellarium. There's the celestial equator. There's the constellation of Cancer, and there's 23.5 degrees. So it goes through the constellation of Cancer. And these are curved lines. These are not straight lines. They're curved. And in this one, north is at the top. Now we go to the south. There's the celestial equator. There's Capricorn, and that's 23.5 degrees. So again, the curved line goes through Capricorn, and south is below. On the ground, you saw the limits of the tropics, but here's what happens every year with the sun. You have your 2 solstices and your equinox. So sometimes the sun rises due east, sometimes it rises south of east, sometimes it rises north of east. And those limits are 23.5 degrees. So this is what you see on the horizon. And I showed you what it looks like on the ground where the tropics are located. But in the tropics is the only place that the sun actually passes overhead, and the planets, which I'll talk about later. So what does it mean that Africa spans northern and southern hemisphere? I think this is a little animation. So this is looking north, and you can see Polaris, the star that doesn't move, right there. And you see the bear, you see Andromeda, you see Cassiopeia, but you also see that the sky rotates counterclockwise. When you go to the southern hemisphere, there is no star that marks the south celestial pole, but you have various nearby constellations that point out where the pole is as it rotates, and notice that it rotates clockwise. If you're in the tropics, which I don't have a video of, everything rises in the east and sets in the west. These circular motions are not so important because the whole sky moves. So what is cultural astronomy? Here's a nice definition from 1997 by Nick Campion. And this is a picture of me and Nick in Slovenia in maybe 2012 or so. So here's his definition. The study of the use of astronomical knowledge, beliefs, or theories to inspire, inform, or influence social forms and ideologies, or any aspect of human behavior. Let's throw it all in. Cultural astronomy also includes the modern disciplines of ethnoastronomy, which comes out of anthropology, and archaeoastronomy, which is related to archaeology. So going back to what you're more familiar with, which is astronomy and astrophysics, it's quantitative, it's mathematically intensive, and it has universal physical rules. But also, it's descriptive in terms of plasmas and things that are more difficult to assign hard physics to. Sometimes environment is important in space. For example, around stars, depending on the type of stars, the age of the star. In clouds, is it an ionized cloud? Is it a molecular cloud? Or in between galaxies and the types of galaxies. When we go to cultural astronomy, these things on the left are very important. The sky, I hope I've demonstrated to you, the place on the Earth, because the sky moves differently depending on where you are, the environment, and you can't have a study of cultural astronomy if there are no people. You absolutely must have people. No people, no cultural astronomy. So it can be quantitative, such as in archaeoastronomy, where you're measuring alignments of buildings, etc., to celestial bodies using the tools of archaeology, but also qualitative, documenting rituals, interviews with knowledge holders, using the tools of anthropology and folklore, or both, such as studying navigation by the stars. Part of it is quantitative, part of it is qualitative. So at this point, you should think cultural astronomy encompasses everything, and it's very, very interdisciplinary. So for cultural astronomy, environment matters, but not how you would think. You would think that places that are dry, that have less cloud cover over the years, would have more sophisticated astronomy knowledge and sky knowledge, but that's not true. Whether you have bad weather or not, when the stars are out, humans have always engaged with them. They've wondered what they are, they've made up stories, they've used them. So it doesn't matter what the cloud cover is. If you think that I'm lying, think about Europe, which is very cloudy, and no one would say that their astronomy is lacking. In reality, why is the local environment important? Because it is often reflected in the sky. So you have local animals that are transformed into sky animals. You have local animal behaviors that are transformed into sky behaviors. So let's get on with some data. So celestial bodies with physics names. Everyone knows, you should know, what are the brightest stars in the sky? Number 1, the sun. Number 2, Sirius. Number 3, Canopus. So Canopus or Canopus, however you want to pronounce it. And so Sirius is seen easily from both the northern and southern hemisphere, but Canopus is mainly seen in the southern hemisphere. So usually when I'm giving this talk, I'm not in South Africa. So I can say Inquinquazi, and everyone would believe me, right? But I'm not going to try that here. You guys know that I am killing all these names. So I'm just going to tell you where it's from and what it means. So from Swaziland, the Swazi people, their name for Canopus is basically brilliant star. Now, some stars are red in the sky, and these are the brightest, reddest stars are Betelgeuse in Orion, Antares in the Scorpion, and Aldebaran in Taurus. So from Somalia, you have a herd of camels where one of the stars is red, and that is Betelgeuse. And then another star, which is Antares, which is here in the Scorpio, the heart of the Scorpion, they call that a war star. It's a hard-won battle star. That's the name of the star, Libkas. And what it's indicating is the red is blood. One of the concepts in cultural astronomy is stellification. Who or what gets put in the sky and why and how. So going to Egypt, we have 3 sky gods, Horus, Isis, and Osiris, right? So the museum in Scotland, the National Museum of Scotland, cannot compare to the collections at the British Museum in London. Nonetheless, I have a lot of pictures that I've taken just wandering around the museum in Scotland, and this is one of them. So here we have Horus with his little sky disk overhead, and here we have the winged solar disk, which may or may not be a representation of the sun during an eclipse. And the story is that Osiris is god of the underworld, Isis is his sister and his wife, and Horus is their son. And their brother kills Osiris and dismembers him and throws him around Egypt. And so Isis is always looking to put Osiris back together. So the part of the sky that we're looking at is this part where we have Osiris is Orion, Isis is Sirius, part of Canis Major, and the sky moves this way. So she's chasing Osiris to put them back together. And she also is responsible, Sirius, the sighting of the star, is responsible for setting the Egyptian calendar and marking when the flooding of the Nile happens. So not only is that an example of stellification, it's also an example of celestial art and sky symbolism. All the words on the left are the same, but I want to emphasize that this is a similar, it's a related concept when you're looking at artworks and gods and sky, celestial art and sky symbolism. Continue on with celestial art and sky symbolism. One of my favorite pieces is this floor mosaic, which is pretty huge, which is in the Bordeaux Museum in Tunisia. I did field work for like 3 field seasons while I was studying navigation by the stars among the fishermen in a small island off the coast of Tunisia. And in between, I would go and look at museums and archaeological sites and things like that. And I found this, not that it was lost, but I found it in the Bordeaux Museum, and it's an amazing piece. So in the center, you have the 7 what they call the seven planetary deities or luminaries. And around the outside, you have the zodiac constellations. So what are the seven? Remember, this is the Roman North Africa. This dates from about 100 Common Era. And the seven luminaries are the sun and the moon. And then Mercury, I think they're listed there. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So that makes up the seven. And it also happens to be our days of the week, right? What are we talking about in the sky? So you know there's the tropics. So you know that the sun moves to the north and to the south and back to the north over the course of the year. But that path that it takes is called the ecliptic. And the ecliptic is this line here. And the planets also, because the plane of our solar system is flat, right? They also follow that line. They don't wander far from that line. So this is what it looks like with the constellations turned on. You can see the familiar zodiac constellations. You see Leo, I think this is Virgo, and then over here is Aries and Pisces, and then it gets kind of crowded in the middle. But you get the point. You know the zodiac constellations. So another way of interpreting this mosaic is that you have your seven wanderers, and then the path on the outside is where they wander. More sky symbolism. This is one of my favorite cases. It's from the Bamana people in Mali. And this is also the Scottish Museum. And we're going to be talking about this figurine right there. Again, you've seen this now. The sun moves north and south and back north again or south again. But if you see that going back and forth, it can be interpreted as a zigzag, which is how the Bamana people interpret it, as a zigzag pattern. So it's the path that the sun makes on the horizon over the year. They actually, I want to say first they use it to make decoration in many contexts other than just this figurine, right? But the zigzag is in the main of this. It's called a mask. And they actually plant their fields in the zigzag pattern as well. We don't know if they do it still. But this, as you know, if you're a farmer, it's an anti-erosion to not have rows in which the wind can just pick things up and carry them off. So the last thing on here is that this is a mythological figure that's a cross between a lion and an antelope. And if you see an antelope run away from a prey, it doesn't run straight. It zigzags to try to get it off. So you have repeated zigzags. So it's called a chihuahua or chihuahua. And this one is the real thing in the Scottish Museum. It's about 5 feet tall. And if you look carefully, right there is a picture of these masks being used. So they actually tie them to the top of their heads. So on the left, we have the male, which represents the sun. And on the right, we have the female, which represents the earth. So you have the male usually has a mane with these zigzags, and the female usually has a little baby on the back. These masks are taken out when they're cultivating, when it's time to plant, and also when it's time to harvest. And they do a dance, and they have a song, and it's a fertility dance. It's a male-female dance, it's a sun and earth dance, and it's a fertility dance. And don't ask me, I've never seen it. So my plan was to go to Mali and study this, but I never got the money to go. So this one comes from Canada, the History Museum in Canada, and this one is from the British Museum, because as we know, they stole everything. Okay. Now let's go to South Africa. So we went to Egypt, We went to Tunisia, we went to Mali, now we're going to South Africa. And we're going to talk about sky lore, which is the myth, legends, sayings, and stories that are related to the sky. And I think I've read 3 Zulu origin stories, but this is one of them. And so who are the Zulu? They're the people of the sky, and apparently Zulu means sky. I'm sure there's someone who's going to say Zulu doesn't mean sky, but this is the source that I had. In the origin story, the heavenly realm was disturbed by a rowdy young man. So they had cattle up in the heavenly realm, and he would steal the cattle, run them everywhere. And so they got pretty annoyed with this teenager, because we all get annoyed by teenagers. And so they put a cord, an umbilicus, from the heavenly realm down to the surface of the earth. And in anthropology and some philosophical traditions, that's called a axis mundi, a connection between the heavens and the earth. So they let him down, and then they closed up the hole and went about their merry way. But when they checked later, sometime later, he was not doing so well. And they said he was lonely. So they reached down and they made humans to keep him company. And the humans and that teenager were the origin of the Zulu people. Aha, you've probably heard this a bazillion times, the story of the hopeless hunter. So the part of the sky we're looking at is around Orion again. Here, this is more the way Orion looks from here, from the southern hemisphere. And then the Pleiades are here in Aldebaran. And this is what it looks like without the constellation markers. But you can still see that, there's the Pleiades right there. So this comes from the Khoikhoi people of South Africa. It's also called the curse of the women or the hopeless hunter. So Eob, I think I've got that one right, is the hunter who starts out as Aldebaran. I think I have a little animation here. Let me start that. So he's the hunter. Here are his wives. This is some click at the beginning, which I can't say. And his wives are the Pleiades, and he starts out as Aldebaran, which is one of the red stars. And the women send him out to go hunting, and he needs to bring back meat for his 6 wives. And they tell him, don't come home if you don't bring back meat. So he goes, and we think he becomes Betelgeuse next, this other red star. And he goes hunting, and he sees a herd of zebra, which are the belt of Orion. And so he pulls back, he shoots his arrow, which we think is the sword, and he misses. And I think he's hopeless because he has only 1 arrow. But there's a lion here, Rigel's the lion, and so he has to wait for the lion to move away to go get his 1 arrow so that he can then shoot again for the zebra. But he's frozen in time. He can't go home because his wife said, don't come home if you don't bring meat. And he has to wait. So he's forever waiting in the sky for his chance to get his arrow. So this we have both stellification and sky lore. But what is it telling us? It's telling us a lot about the people and their codes. So polygamous marriages are okay, but you have to feed your family. And you need to keep harmony with your 6 wives. So that's all encoded in the story, which is then encoded in the sky. Now let's go to the Xhosa people. And again, for their Canopus, the third brightest star, their name is Sparkling. But they also have those, which were the women in the last story, are the digging stars. And they appear in June, and therefore cultivation, the time in which to plant and harvest. To plant. This is probably the more common picture that you see of the Pleiades. This is through either binoculars or a telescope. However, if you go outside, I pointed out how tiny they are in the sky. They're just this little blob over here. So when you go out looking for the Pleiades, look for a tiny little blob of stars. They're still recognizable. I've seen them here since I've been in South Africa. So, but you notice that the name for the Pleiades across these groups, the Swahili, the Sotho-Swana, the Zulu, and the Xhosa, are all the digging stars, cultivating stars, digging stars. And so something's going on. So what is going on, though? How can they all use the Pleiades for predicting the time to cultivate? Again, looking at our map, you see that the Swahili are generally on the east coast of Africa. And then we have our ethnic groups in South Africa. They're trade partners, so the name can be, part of the trade system, the Indian Ocean monsoon trade system, right? But how can they use the Pleiades when you have some in the northern hemisphere, some in the tropics, and some not in the tropics? So the answer is that they adapt their use of the Pleiades to their environment. So in some cases, this is long text, but essentially what it says is that some people are looking for the Pleiades to arrive on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, and they'll say that's the time for planting. Some of them will wait for the Pleiades to be directly overhead at sunset, and they'll say that's their time for planting. And then others will wait for the Pleiades to be sort of in the west at sunset, and that will be their time for planting. So they're all still connecting the Pleiades with planting, but they're using the Pleiades in different part of the skies, which means at different times of the year. And that's how they all use the Pleiades as the cultivating stars. Hold on, let me take a sip of water. You can start reading that if you want. Okay, so now we go to the Karoo, to the Nam people. Of course, I'm killing it, I know. And Gabo, I've heard that enough times I can almost say it correctly. So he was, a South African protecting his land against the evil Europeans, and he got caught. So they took him down to the prisons in Cape Town, and you probably have heard the story. This happened in the 1800s, and there was a linguist who interacted with many of the people from the Karoo and learned their languages, and those were Willem Bleek and his sister-in-law, Lucy Lloyd. And they have the Bleek and Lloyd collection down at UCT a few years ago. It was almost burned, but it was not burned in a fire, so we still have it. Most of it's been digitized. So they have notebooks and notebooks of interviews and the contents of, all kinds of things about life in the Karoo among these people. So included in Gabo's testimony is myths about the sun, the Milky Way, and the moon, things about the seasons, stars coming in, so they indicate this, stars leaving the sky, they indicate that. And there's all kinds of narratives and personal histories and rituals and list of stars. And at the time, in the 1800s, they enlisted an astronomer to go to help them identify what those stars are. So most of the things that he said, an astronomer at some point has said, this is this star and this is that star. Now, these people were thought to be exterminated, just gone. But in 2011, Jose de Prada Sampur did his PhD research in the area, gathering folklore, and he realized these were the same stories. The only difference is that they now speak Afrikaans. So they've been co-opted into be basically laborers on the farms, but the oral tradition remained just in Afrikaans. So I had the pleasure a few years later of going with Jose up to the Karoo and doing some field work. And so I'm going to show you two things that I learned during that field work. So the first had to do with the Milky Way, which they call Hamosrat. Don't speak Afrikaans either, right? Again, when I'm abroad, nobody corrects me. But you guys know that I'm not doing this right. So these are the three people who talked about the Milky Way. Gritsky was the one who gave the most information. So the only woman in the bunch. This interview is actually on YouTube, so you can look it up and see it. So she said that it lies east-west in summer and south-north in winter and is brightest in the winter. So again, using stellarium, I checked it all out and she was correct. All right, so here's where I need the microphone. We're good for time. Where is my microphone? Okay, here we go, because we have a video clip. It's about 6 minutes. So we're going to start it and hopefully get the sound. I have to make sure the sound. Okay, ready? Ready? For determining when it's going to rain and the moon, if Mr. knows about that, looking at the moon to see if it's going to rain.
Ekskuus tog, kan jy vir ons sê of jy kan by die maan sien of dit gaan reën of nie?
Ja, dat kan ik niet. De maan is hallo maan dus. En die leest zo recht, maar het is zo dat die onderste punt zo is. Dat scheppen. Dat is ja, weet je verdiend. Ja, het is schijnt, ja, het is schijnzaam. Dat is op die punt liggen, iets scheppen, 1 punt van hem. Dan kan je weten hoe wanneer het.
Ja, het is zo. Het is zo, daar heeft hij.
Die zeeuws, hij man overletten.
Maar het is zo.
Dan in de namiddag, met de zon dik aan het liggen. Dan leg je een regenboog, maar we zeggen een regenboog. Als die regenboog weer dan zon opleggen, zon tot een liggend. Daar kan je weten, nou zit je weer verder. En dat is nooit zo, je op channel is zo blijven erin. Zij raken me in 9 jaar gezien is. Je gezien dat die dan is leeg. Ik zei nee, ik zeg een regenboog vandaag gelegen namiddag. Toen is die zon tot die kan gezien, dat ik nou weer afrend. En toen is het ook zo, dan doet het heel net.
So you can't game no good.
So what time of year, and do they look at the east or the west when they're looking for that crescent moon?
Okay. Watter kant moet 'n mens kyk? Moet 'n mens oos of wes kyk as jy nou kyk vir wanneer die maan so lê?
Ja, kijk die.
West.
West.
Je moet west kijken.
Ja, west. Alleen west. Toen het
First crescent.
Onderste
Je moet
punt.
kijken west.
Ja, west. We zijn onderste punt met skip. Dat zei skip.
Hij leert ons west.
Ja.
Hij leert ons west. Ik denk als hij, ons noemen we de nieuwe man. Als hij klein is, nou dat hij kleintje is, dan leer je west. Nou, daar kan je hem kijken, als hij nou zal erin hangen, hij hangt zo, dan kan je bij skip. Zo. Dat is erin. Af aan hem aan. Nou, als hij zo leert, hij is nog een kleintje, leert zijn rug. Ik ken niet wat hij nou, want hij leert zijn rug, leert op zijn rug. En mensen kan hem mooi zien. Dat hij al, ze heeft hem al een sterk man, is dat hij al groter dan hij blijft zo, kan je maar erin verwacht wezen. Kom erin. En op een andere dag, dan zie je die weer steek op. Die noordenwind waait en dan kom erin. Maar ik heb nog niet de kans dat hij nog heeft van die regenboog moest leren. Bij regenboog weet ik, hij stopt weer in. Ik weet die regenboog, dat hij in met erin stopt. En ik hoor alles zeggen, hij zegt, oosters. En die zon dus west, lag bij de ondergaande kant, aan de wind. Ik ken hem nog niet weer.
So they disagree about that one, which is, they quite agree about that rain, but he says that if the sun is that side and there's a rainbow there, it will rain. But she says no, rainbow stops the rain. But
So-
he says no, if the rainbow is that side, it will rain.
So how does he himself know when it's really going to rain? What does he look for?
Hulle vra of jy weet hoe weet jy wanneer dit nou reën? Is hierdie wolkies vandag, dis nou nie reënwolkies. Hoe weet jy wanneer kom dit reën?
Nee, kijk, voorheen met die gehoormerken, maar nou alles. Kijk, nou sien meer die tijd dus ongeveer waar die reën. Maar wat alles gewoonlijk, als die oosten van Weida. Daar reën door het pad. Daar reën het. En daar van nou steken we nou op. En daar komt reën. Maar nou zie ik maar waar bij deze maar al kan dan ook. Je weet niet meer waar kan met je van kip. Maar nou is dat voor iemand gezegd. Dit is groot geworden, alles is van 11 uur af opsteek. En je weet van 2, 3 uur oriënting. En nou oriënting niet meer, ik vind we gaan nou niet nacht, we gaan oriënting. Ik weet niet, die is zeker nog maar, weet je, moet dat nou zijn. Weet je, nog maar anders gedraaid worden. Als je meer hij deed als alles met palen, zeer paal trouwens. Niet, als we begonnen met het oosten van de wijk. Dat was alle gewerkt, en hij goed is oorlog gewerkt van je wat meer. Het is krap donkisch. Werk was nog ja, dan maar zo alle werken, ja, dan maar zo laten aan de roeien. Om je losgrond op te krijgen, want het erin, dan gezegd het erin, dan maar je weet het erin. Maar dan zit die oosten van wat erbij, hij bij hem mee.
No, he says, you know, it used to be the wind from the east, and it also used to be if the clouds actually gather at about 11, then you would know it rains at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. But nowadays it comes at night time, so the world is totally upside down. It doesn't work like that anymore.
Want ik weet wat, als het weer begonnen werken, moet je die maand opletten. Die maand komen ze uit, als het blij. Dan maar raak wat nog weg, dan kom je een nieuwe maand.
Ja.
Nou, als hij zo leert, dan schep je dat gewoon niet.
Ja, ik hoor
Maar
het ook.
als hij begint zo op zijn punt staan, dan kan in het noorden gaan, dan kan je weer dat erin zitten.
Ja.
Naar erin.
Ja, ik ken ook dat.
Ja.
No, he says that the only thing he knows is that when it is the moon that looks like this, it means that it's like a holder, water holder, can't rain. But the moment it starts, either it turns or the other way around, it can actually.
Okay. So that was mostly in Afrikaans, but yeah, we need to mute it. Okay. So that was mostly in Afrikaans, which I wanted you to hear Afrikaans, but you know, technology gets us every time. Okay, so what was he saying? Where the three of them were talking about the tilt of the first crescent moon. We're actually in first crescent moon right now. So if you look to the west after sunset, you'll see the nice crescent moon and the horns of the crescent moons. And so what they said was when it's tilted, it's pouring out the water, right? So it's raining. And when it's like this, it's holding, right? There is no physical relationship, no causal relationship between the moon and the rainy season, right? But now where did I put this? Here we go. So here is the chart of the rainy season in that part of the Karoo. And here you have January, February, March, April, May. And you see that those are all pouring moons, which correlates to the rainy season. You don't really see a big difference in that tilt until you get to June. Then it looks more like this, right? So they've noticed a correlation between the sighting of the crescent moon and the rainfall pattern in their region. Now, I was not alarmed. I knew what question to ask because I'd seen this before. In the 1970s, I think Deirdre Le Pen, who I met, was doing fieldwork among the Ngas people of Nigeria. And they were considered to be the sons of the moon, the people of the moon. And they also used the sighting of the first crescent moon to determine if it's going to be rainy or dry. Now, of course, we have far south where we are with the Karoo, and then we have northern hemisphere just above the equator. So again, they can't both be doing the same thing. So what they've done is they've adapted again what it means, because this is their rainy season and this is their dry season. And you see that these would be considered holding moons in the Karoo, but instead, those are the rain moons in Nigeria, where these people are. So just like they do with the Pleiades, they're using a celestial body They're adapting it to their needs where they are regionally. So they're paying attention to their environment. And then they're drawing correlations that are helpful for them for harvesting and planting and things like that. So that brings me to the end of my talk. And here were my takeaways for the beginning. Africa is big. This is a huge topic. There's maybe 4 people in the world doing this for the entire continent, which is very hard. And I wanted you to gain an understanding of some of the ways that astronomy and sky knowledge is entwined in culture in Africa. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very informative talk, and
I'm gonna get-
sorry for the little issue with the video. Are there any questions for Jarita, please?
So, Jarita, I always had a problem seeing,
Only one?
yeah, multiple, but the main one in my life is that I had a problem recognizing animals in the stars. So you have Sagittarius or Capricorn, and so I don't see the mapping. So then, but my question is now, do all these different ethnic groups or peoples, do they all have the same mapping? Because I would expect all these mappings to be different. Is that what it is?
Yes, it is. You answered your own question. Yeah. Now, remember that there are linguistically and related people who share things, right? So they're usually, in proximity within 100 miles or so of each other. So they would share, but not like north to south. Yeah. Any other questions?
Do we have any questions online, Donovan? No, not yet. Yeah. Here we go.
Thanks very much for a very informative and interesting talk. In the country of Mali, you've got these scrolls and ancient records that our past president Thabo Mbeki has had a lot of interest in and support in that. And I just wondered whether in those scrolls, do they, and I haven't read enough about it, do they talk about the heavens and the
Yes.
stars and the planets, etc.?
Yes, they do. They do. And it's a colleague of mine called Rodney Tebe Ndupe over at Northwest University. Now he's at Potch. He was at Mafi King, who was part of the project to digitize those scrolls in Mali. It was a South African funded project. And then look at the contents for the astronomy content. And he had a particular agenda, which was to find, he's more quantitative because he comes out of astrophysics. So to find quantitative scrolls that showed that the people of Mali were doing different calculations from the rest of the world that was fluent in Arabic at that time. And he did. I think he found 2 documents that were doing various calculations different from what was, so that showed this innovation, this African innovation that was happening in Mali. A lot of it was stuff that's sort of common to the Arabic script world at that time, but he found a couple of documents that were unique to Mali. And the thing that was different about these, I'm not telling you about the math part, I'm telling you about the scrolls themselves, is that even though they're written in Arabic, it was in a local dialect. So they needed to have local translators because it wasn't just straight Arabic. It was a dialect, a local dialect of Arabic. So I have given you everything I know about that. Okay.
Here.
So the second important story of my life is that I don't understand this, the story about the moon, because the moon to me seems to have a 30-day cycle. And the thing it needed to explain was a seasonal cycle, which is 12 months. So they should have noticed that it doesn't really work, this prediction by the picture you have of the moon, or where I'm at.
It's just a correlation. It's just a correlation.
But it doesn't.
So it's not 30 days. It's like 20, 28, 29 days, right? And and remember, we're not looking at like just the moon. We're looking at a certain phase of the moon, right? That comes around every month, right? But where it is in the sky is going to be different. The tilt is going to be different month by month, as you've seen from the two diagrams, right? So it's just a correlation. It's not a causation, right? So I hope that that's a little bit more clear. Okay.
To do my 10,000 steps.
Right.
Um,
Thelma.
Thanks so much. So I love the aspect of people, and there's no cultural astronomy without people. My question is really around, seeing it from what matters to the people. So while we were crying for the fire destroying the Blake and Lloyd papers, what would you say, gauging from your work in Carnarvon, is the value of this knowledge to the people themselves? Is there a fear of loss of this indigenous knowledge? Are people making a on the ground concerted effort to collate the stories, to record them, to pass on the oral tradition? Or is it just something that's so natural and taken for granted? Because you're saying even so very few researchers have prioritized this area of research. But more so for me then, are the people seeing the worth? Because I know going into a space, you're always doing a needs assessment, but is this need there to retain such a treasured knowledge, even if it's, like you say, maybe off scientifically, but certainly indigenously, it should be captured and recorded and treasured. And I worry, I wonder if that is the case, especially in the Northern Cape with the shifting
Yes.
landscape with the SKA and maybe the farming knowledge being less valuable with the AGA, or a changing pattern of the need for rain in the same way a farmer would have needed rain.
Yeah, I have to take this in stages, Thelma. Okay, so the first question was, do they see the value in this? The answer is, I don't know. Okay. And then, are they preserving it? Jose preserved some of it. I don't know if anyone else is preserving it. So when we went up to the Karoo, it was with an agenda, which was part of the Shared Sky exhibit that was funded by the Square Kilometer Array. It's Shared Sky. It was Australia. The SKA is both in Australia and in South Africa. And so they wanted to bring people together, and they had this exhibit, and they wanted to have indigenous sky lore from both sides, right? So Jose, and my team, I was there not as a scholar, I was there as a filmmaker. We filmed in the Karoo, and this became the corpus of the Shared Sky exhibit. But interestingly enough, a decision was made not to share the sky knowledge of these people of the Karoo because it's in Afrikaans. Instead, there was one person who was from Plaatfontein who was a professional storyteller who spoke in a click language. And so they actually showed him talking in the click language, which had nothing to do with the Karoo. But they figured that international audiences would rather see someone speaking in the click language than someone speaking Afrikaans. So all the videos that have to do with the sky, I have put maybe even moon and weather on the Cultural Astronomy Project, Cultural Astronomy channel on YouTube. So you can find those and look at them. But as for a larger effort to preserve that, I'm not sure. As for if the young people are interested in what the elders have to say, I'm not sure. And some of these elders have now passed away. So again, I'm not sure because, I left in 2016. And what's happened since 2016, I'm not sure.
There is a question from an online participant. Arun, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question, please.
Thank you. Jarita, that was a very nice talk. There is much similarity between cultural astronomy in South Africa, in particular in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, and India. So, in fact, many years ago, there was a historian who did some research, and he was of the opinion that in ancient times, maybe 400, 500 years ago, people from India actually came to South Africa, stayed for a while, and there were certain stone structures which he attributed to them, which
Yeah,
were
I've read
connected
papers.
to movements of the sun and so forth. Also, there is some similarity between names, in India and in Zulu. For example, the name Dube, which is spelled in the same way in both countries, and in India it's pronounced Dube. So, and other things as well, such as, this idea of polygamy, keeping and herding of cattle and so forth. So, can you comment on that?
I can comment on it. Remember that there was the the Indian Ocean monsoon trade route, which, from Indonesia up and around and then down to at least Madagascar, if not further, right? So this was a yearly trade cycle. And so it's not surprising that you have words that are, and the trade language was Swahili, right? So it's not surprising that you have these, along the shores, you have these connections that, point to other places. They were a long hundreds of years of that monsoon trade network before the Europeans even came around into East Africa. So it's not surprising because they were part of this larger trade network for hundreds of years. Does that answer?
Yes, so thank
Yeah.
you. very
Yes,
much.
thank you.
Thank you. And I think, Donovan, there are two questions in the Q&A. Maybe you can read them, please.
Okay, so there's two. The first one is by Prof. Leratori Liu.
Ah,
Cultural astronomy. It is important to distinguish aspects that are totally poetic or mythological and those that are physical. I believe sometimes all this is taken as knowledge of the skies and leads to confusion. I guess he wants you to comment.
I think that you're underestimating the audience, right? That I think people can recognize a myth as being a myth, right? And a story as being a story, as opposed to physical things like, the star is bright, the star is red, right? I think that people don't confuse those sorts of things. But if I were talking to younger people, I wouldn't present things that would, like I would say, this is a story. Like the hopeless hunter is a story. It's encapsulated in the sky, but it's just a story, right? So I think that my first comment is I think you're underestimating people. And then when I'm speaking to young people, then I try to make those distinctions clear.
Okay, there's one more. What is the relationship between modern astronomy and cultural astronomy? For example, how do we bring our culture into the science that we explore today?
Yeah. So I'm very, provocative. I think of myself as a bad girl. People tell me I'm not. I'm disappointed. But I study astrophysicists as well, right? And so I come out of astrophysics. That's my intellectual foundation. And then I moved into cultural astronomy. And then I do a lot still in the astrophysics community. So they know my work. They know that I do this stuff called cultural astronomy. They invite me to give talks in their astrophysics classes. There are now cultural astronomy classes around the world. They invite me and pay me to give talks. So they're aware of my work. And they like the cultural embeddedness of cultural astronomy and that it's diverse, right? By definition, when you're talking about cultural astronomy, you're talking about diversity. So almost every astronomy, like beginning astronomy class, starts with cultural astronomy stuff. And then after that, they get into the nitty gritty. So they kind of seduced the students, like, you want to actually stay in astronomy because we have all this cool stuff and this cultural stuff. And then they take all the culture out and just present numbers and physics. Not totally. I'm exaggerating, but they do use this. as introductory, and even introductory to certain things. Like if we're going to talk about stars, then it's easy to talk about how stars were viewed and understood in 6 or 7 different cultures. When we talk about galaxies, there's 4 galaxies that you can see naked eye, right? 1, the Milky Way, the large and small clouds in the southern hemisphere, and Andromeda. So you can talk about how did people view those objects in the sky before you start your lecture on galaxies, for example. So, you know, I think that students like it, right? They like stories. You know, an indigenous way of conveying knowledge is through stories. And so our brains are hardwired to remember stories more than any other way. So if you can couch your lesson as a story, then you're going to win.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then let's thank our speaker again very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you here and all of the participants online.